The conference room went silent. Every head turned toward me as Mark snorted, leaning back in his leather chair with that smug grin I had come to despise over the years. "Oh, this resignation letter. Really, Oliva." He waved the document dismissively like it was a napkin used to wipe coffee off a desk. "You think this little note is going to make a difference?" My stomach twisted, my hands gripping the edges of the polished mahogany table until my knuckles turned white and started to ache. The humiliation was immediate, sharp, and devastatingly public. Every colleague who had glanced my way was now suddenly fascinated by their phones or notebooks, pretending they hadn't witnessed the exchange. My face burned with a mixture of fury and disbelief, but I kept my expression carefully neutral. Mark continued his performance, clearly enjoying himself. "Does anyone here actually care about this?" he asked the room, gesturing theatrically with my letter. Silence answered him. Not a single person met my eyes. I felt invisible, expendable, like everything I had worked for could be erased with his mocking laughter. But my pulse remained steady. I had a plan they couldn't see. "Let me back up and tell you who I am. My name is Oliva Hart, and I had spent 10 years at this company. 10 long years of quietly building every department from the ground up, while people like Mark took all the credit. I was 30 years old, ambitious, and every single ounce of my career had been dedicated to proving myself in a workplace that seemed designed to keep women like me in the background. I had watched Mark climb the corporate ladder on the backs of other people's work, mine included. He was the type who thrived on undermining women, claiming ownership of ideas he never had, and treating genuine confidence as arrogance whenever it came from someone he considered beneath him. I had started as a junior analyst fresh out of college, working late nights and early mornings, solving problems that senior executives couldn't figure out. Slowly, methodically, I had built relationships, learned every system, understood every weakness in our corporate structure. While Mark had been networking at golf courses and taking long lunches, I had been mastering the actual business. And now, finally, it was time to use everything I had learned. I handed him the letter 3 days ago, watching carefully as he skimmed it with barely concealed amusement. "This is really happening?" he had asked, that same condescending tone dripping from every word. "You're actually resigning? Where are you even going to go, Oliva?" I had smiled softly, saying nothing, just letting him assume whatever made him feel superior. Inside, I was calm, almost amused by how little he understood about what was really happening. The document he held wasn't what it appeared to be on the surface. Yes, it looked like a standard resignation letter, proper formatting, professional language, all the expected phrases about pursuing new opportunities and grateful for the experience. But embedded within the carefully chosen legal language were clauses that only someone reading very closely would recognize. It was a corporate maneuver disguised as a resignation, a Trojan horse that Mark had welcomed through the gates with laughter. He had no idea that by accepting this letter, by waving it around like a trophy, he was triggering a sequence of events that would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. Mark spent the next 2 days parading my letter around the office like some kind of victory banner. He showed it to colleagues during coffee breaks, making jokes about my dramatic exit and my inability to handle the pressure of real corporate life. I watched all of it silently from my desk, nodding every person he showed it to, cataloging every laugh he received, observing which colleagues seemed uncomfortable with his behavior. Each reaction told me something useful, who had integrity, who was simply afraid of him, who might become an ally when the time was right. Mark's arrogance was his greatest weakness, and he was displaying it perfectly for everyone to see. He thought he was demonstrating his power by humiliating me publicly. What he was actually doing was alienating people, creating resentment, and proving to anyone paying attention that he was a bully who couldn't lead with respect. Every laugh he gave me, every mocking comment, every dismissive gesture, it all fueled the strategy I was about to unleash. I kept my face neutral, my demeanor professional, playing the part of the hurt employee who was too defeated to fight back. That night, I went home to my small apartment and spread every document I had been collecting across my dining table. Financial reports, shareholder information, corporate bylaws, contracts, emails I had carefully saved over the years. I had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized, building a case not through emotion or revenge, but through cold, hard facts and legal strategy. I analyzed the company's financial structure with the precision of a surgeon, identifying every weak point, every place where Mark had overstepped his authority, every decision that had cost the company money or reputation. The research took hours. I mapped out exactly how the company's power structure could be shifted legally, ethically, and permanently, without anyone realizing what was happening until it was far too late to stop. The key was patience and precision. One wrong move, one emotional outburst, one moment of visible anger, and the whole plan would crumble. But if I played it perfectly, if I remained calm and strategic, I could turn Mark's own arrogance against him in ways he would never see coming until the trap had already closed. Over the next week, I quietly reconnected with key colleagues, people Mark had alienated over the years with his dismissive attitude and credit-stealing behavior. I reached out through casual conversations, coffee invitations that seemed innocent, friendly emails that appeared to be nothing more than professional networking. "How have you been?" I would ask. "I've been thinking about that project we worked on together." Slowly, carefully, I began planting seeds of loyalty without anyone suspecting I was recruiting for a long game. These were talented people who had been overlooked, undervalued, pushed aside in favor of Mark's favorites. They had ideas, skills, and most importantly, they had grievances. I didn't need to explicitly say anything against Mark. I simply listened to their frustrations, validated their experiences, and subtly reminded them of the work we had accomplished together. I maintained my hurt employee image perfectly, playing the role of someone who was simply trying to find closure before leaving. No one suspected that every conversation was strategic, that every coffee meeting was an interview, that every shared frustration was being cataloged and analyzed for future use. The facade was flawless. 2 weeks after my resignation, Mark made a critical decision on a major client project. The team had advised against his approach, pointing out potential risks and suggesting alternatives, but he dismissed their concerns with his usual arrogance. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said in the meeting I was still attending. "Trust me, this is how you handle premium clients." I said nothing during that meeting, but I documented everything meticulously. Every email, every decision point, every warning that was ignored. I saved it all in a secure folder with timestamps and context. I knew from experience that Mark's approach was flawed, that it would lead to problems within weeks, maybe days. His method prioritized short-term appearances over long-term sustainability, flashy presentations over actual results. It was the same pattern I had watched him repeat for years, somehow always managing to blame others when things fell apart. But this time would be different. This time, I was watching carefully, gathering evidence, preparing to use his own mistakes against him. The failures would be public, documented, and undeniable. And when they happened, I would be ready to capitalize on every single one of them. The quarterly board meeting arrived with its usual tension and corporate theater. I attended under the guise of providing a final transition report before my departure. A role Mark had graciously allowed me because he thought it made him look magnanimous. The board members sat around the long table, most of them older men in expensive suits who rarely paid attention to anyone below executive level. Mark took center stage, presenting his quarterly achievements with the confidence of someone who believed his own propaganda. He claimed credit for projects I had led, cited success metrics that were actually the result of other people's work, and painted a picture of flawless leadership. I sat quietly in the corner, taking notes, waiting for my turn to speak. When the opportunity came, I presented data about our client relationships, department efficiency, and project outcomes. I didn't contradict Mark directly. That would have seemed petty and emotional. Instead, I simply provided facts that told a different story, numbers that revealed cracks in his narrative. I watched several board members exchange glances, saw them making notes, noticed the shift in their body language. They were starting to see inconsistencies, beginning to question, and I hadn't even needed to say his name. Mark genuinely believed I was leaving quietly. He celebrated behind closed doors with his inner circle, telling them how he had finally gotten rid of the dead weight and could now bring in people who actually understand corporate culture. I heard about these conversations through the network I had been building, colleagues who were increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior and willing to share information. I played my part perfectly during this time. I appeared emotional when appropriate, seeming devastated about leaving the job I had dedicated so much of my life to. I spoke about moving on and finding new opportunities in tones that suggested defeat rather than strategy. Some colleagues even sent me sympathetic messages, not knowing that every expression of concern was actually validation that my performance was believable. Mark saw exactly what he wanted to see: a woman who had been broken by his dismissal, someone who was slinking away with her tail between her legs. He had no idea that behind my sad smiles and quiet demeanor, I was setting the stage for the most calculated takeover he would ever witness. Every piece was moving into position, every player taking their place on the board. Weeks passed with strategic patience. I remained calm, collected, and unfailingly professional in every interaction. When Mark made cutting remarks, I responded with polite neutrality. When colleagues asked about my plans, I gave vague, pleasant answers that revealed nothing. I didn't retaliate publicly, didn't send angry emails, didn't do anything that would compromise the long game I was playing. Instead, I focused on strengthening alliances, gathering more evidence, and watching Mark grow increasingly careless. His arrogance expanded to fill the space he thought my departure had created. He started making even bolder decisions, taking even more credit, dismissing even more voices. He truly believed he had won, that he had successfully eliminated a threat and solidified his position. The board's earlier questions seemed to have faded from his mind, dismissed as momentary doubts that his charm had smoothed over. What he didn't realize was that those seeds of doubt I had planted were growing quietly in the background, watered by every new mistake he made, every new person he alienated, every new decision that prioritized ego over wisdom. The trap was almost ready to spring. During this time, I made a series of quiet financial moves that no one at the company noticed. Using savings I had accumulated over 10 years of careful living, utilizing legal loopholes I had researched extensively, and partnering with former colleagues who believed in my vision, I began acquiring company shares. Not large amounts that would trigger attention, but small, strategic purchases that accumulated slowly over several weeks. Each transaction was legal, properly documented, and completely invisible to Mark and his circle. I worked with a financial advisor who understood corporate maneuvering, someone who helped me navigate the complex rules about share ownership and voting rights. The company was partially publicly traded, which meant shares were available if you knew where to look and had the resources to purchase them. Each small acquisition was a piece of the puzzle, seemingly insignificant on its own, but powerful when combined with all the others. Mark had no reason to monitor share movements at this level. He was too focused on his executive position to worry about minor stock transactions. But those minor transactions were about to create a major shift in power that would catch everyone by surprise. I began volunteering for key projects, particularly ones where Mark had made promises he couldn't keep or started initiatives he didn't understand well enough to complete. When clients sent confused emails about deliverables, I quietly stepped in with clarifications. When deadlines were missed due to Mark's poor planning, I worked late to salvage what could be saved. In team meetings, I offered solutions to problems he had created, always framing my contributions as helpful support rather than corrections. To everyone watching, I looked like a dedicated employee trying to leave the company in good shape before departing. But the effect was subtle and powerful. I was demonstrating competence while Mark's mistakes became more visible by contrast. Clients began mentioning my name specifically in their feedback, thanking me for my responsiveness and clarity. Team members started coming to me with questions before going to Mark, trusting my expertise over his authority. He noticed this shift but misinterpreted it, thinking people were simply saying goodbye to me, not realizing they were actually recognizing who had been doing the real work all along. His credibility was eroding without him understanding why, each small interaction chipping away at the reputation he had built on stolen credit and empty promises. I made a particular effort to mentor newer employees during this period, young analysts and associates who were hungry to learn, but felt lost in the company's political maze. I shared real knowledge with them, how to navigate corporate structures, how to document their work, how to build genuine professional relationships rather than just networking for advancement. These newer employees began to admire my professionalism and integrity, especially when they compared it to Mark's management style of taking credit and assigning blame. They started asking me questions, seeking my advice, treating me like a leader even though I technically held no official authority over them anymore. The shift happened gradually, almost organically. A junior analyst would email me instead of Mark about a client issue. An associate would ask my opinion during a meeting before presenting to the executives. Small moments that accumulated into something bigger, a quiet transfer of respect and loyalty that was happening right under Mark's nose. He was too busy managing up, trying to impress the board and senior executives, to notice that the people actually doing the work were increasingly reporting to me in everything but title. The foundation of his power was crumbling, and he was completely oblivious. The client disaster came exactly when I predicted it would. The major project Mark had insisted on handling his way collapsed spectacularly when the client realized their actual needs weren't being met. They sent a scathing email to the company president, threatening to pull their contract and demanding immediate answers. Mark scrambled, trying to deflect blame onto his team, but the paper trail I had documented told a clear story about whose decisions had led to the failure. I stepped in calmly, reaching out directly to the client with a detailed plan for correcting the situation. I worked through an entire weekend, rebuilding what Mark had broken, communicating clearly about what had gone wrong and exactly how we would fix it. By Monday morning, the client was satisfied, the contract was saved, and they had specifically requested that I be the primary contact going forward. The company president sent out a newsletter highlighting the successful turnaround, and while she diplomatically didn't mention names, the client themselves sent a public thank you email that mentioned me specifically. I watched Mark's face during the all-hands meeting where this was discussed. He looked visibly rattled, his usual confidence shaken by the implicit comparison between his failure and my success. During my extensive research into company bylaws, the kind of boring legal documents that most people never read, I discovered something fascinating. There was a clause buried deep in the founding documents about shareholder voting rights in cases of executive misconduct or demonstrated incompetence affecting company performance. The language was vague enough that it had never been invoked, but specific enough to be legally binding if properly applied. The threshold for triggering this clause required a certain percentage of shareholder votes, and through my careful accumulation of shares plus relationships I had built with other minority shareholders who were frustrated with current management, I was approaching that threshold. I worked with a corporate lawyer who specialized in these kinds of governance issues, making sure every step I took was absolutely legal and ethically sound. This wasn't about cheating or manipulating. It was about using the company's own rules to create accountability where none had existed before. I needed just a little more time, a few more pieces to fall into place, and then the endgame would be in motion. Mark had no idea any of this was happening because he had never bothered to understand the company's actual structure. He knew how to play politics, but not how the business really worked at a fundamental level. I spent the next several weeks consolidating alliances with people in legal and finance teams, the departments that actually understood how the company functioned beneath all the executive posturing. I had coffee meetings with the senior legal counsel, discussing hypothetical scenarios about corporate governance. I reviewed financial reports with accounting managers who were quietly frustrated by Mark's expensive mistakes. Every conversation was careful, ethical, and professional. I never asked anyone to do anything improper, never suggested they violate their professional obligations. I simply asked questions, shared observations, and listened to their concerns. These were smart people who had been watching the same patterns I had been documenting, who had their own evidence of mismanagement and poor decision-making. They were ready for change, but had no mechanism to create it, until now. Mark noticed nothing during this entire period. He assumed I was gone and irrelevant, already mentally written off as someone who had left the company. He stopped paying attention to what I was doing, stopped monitoring my movements, stopped caring about my presence in meetings. His arrogance had made him blind, and that blindness was exactly what I needed to complete my plan without interference. Mark made one final arrogant move that sealed his fate. He attempted to fire me preemptively, apparently deciding that my continued presence was somehow threatening even though he claimed I was irrelevant. He called me into his office with HR present, clearly expecting a quick, clean termination. "Olivia, we've decided to accelerate your departure timeline," he said with barely concealed satisfaction. "Today will be your last day." I smiled calmly and pulled out a folder I had prepared weeks ago. Inside were copies of my employment contract, documentation of my shareholder status, and a legal opinion from outside counsel about wrongful termination. "Actually, Mark, according to my contract and my current shareholder position, you don't have the authority to unilaterally terminate me without board approval and documented cause," I said quietly, sliding the documents across his desk. The HR representative's eyes widened as she read through them. Mark's face turned red. "This is ridiculous." "I'm your supervisor. You're an executive," I interrupted gently. "But I'm a shareholder with certain protected rights. If you'd like to pursue termination, we can certainly bring this to the board with full documentation of the circumstances." He backed down, flustered and angry, but unable to proceed without risking exposure of his misuse of authority. The HR representative made notes, clearly uncomfortable with what had just been revealed about the power dynamics. The board would hear about this interaction, and it would be one more crack in Mark's foundation. Mark's frustration led to sloppiness. He sent out a company-wide email announcing a major strategic shift without proper vetting or approval from the departments that would need to implement it. The email was full of buzzwords and corporate jargon, but fundamentally misunderstood our actual business model and client needs. Within hours, confused responses started flooding in from managers and team leads asking for clarification about contradictory directives. I waited 24 hours, letting the confusion build, and then I sent out my own email, carefully worded, elegantly professional, acknowledging the exciting new vision while providing practical clarification that essentially corrected every mistake Mark had made without explicitly saying his original email was wrong. I framed my corrections as additional context to support implementation and alignment with existing client commitments. The response was immediate and positive. Department heads thanked me for the clarity. Clients who had been copied on the original email expressed relief about my explanation. And most importantly, colleagues began quietly routing their questions and concerns to me rather than back to Mark. I had demonstrated competence, leadership, and practical wisdom in one carefully crafted message. Mark tried to send a follow-up email reasserting his authority, but it only made him look defensive and confused. The contrast between our communication styles was now impossible to ignore. The board called an emergency meeting to address mounting concerns about operational direction and leadership effectiveness. I was invited as a senior team member with institutional knowledge, a designation that gave me a seat at the table without official executive status. Mark attended, clearly expecting to charm his way through whatever questions arose. But this meeting was different from the previous ones. The board members had been talking to department heads, reviewing financial reports, and asking uncomfortable questions about project failures and client complaints. When it was my turn to present, I shared comprehensive data about our actual operational status versus what had been reported in executive summaries. I didn't mention Mark's name a single time. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves, showing clear patterns of misreported success, overlooked problems, and strategic decisions that had cost the company money and reputation. I presented everything calmly, factually, with documentation for every claim I made. The board members exchanged looks that ranged from concern to outright anger. They had been making decisions based on incomplete or misleading information, and they were just now realizing how significant the gaps were. Mark tried to defend himself, but his explanations sounded hollow and defensive compared to the hard evidence I had presented. The meeting ended with the board requesting additional review sessions with various team members to understand the full scope of operational issues. 3 days after that board meeting, I formally submitted my actual resignation letter. Not the fake one from weeks ago that Mark had mocked, but a new document with very different content. This one was addressed directly to the board of directors, and embedded within its professional language were the legal clauses I had been preparing for months. It referenced my shareholder status, invoked the corporate bylaws about governance and accountability, and formally triggered a vote of no confidence in current executive leadership based on the extensive documentation I attached as appendices. The letter activated my shareholder rights, along with the votes I had secured from other concerned shareholders, creating the threshold needed to demand executive review and potential restructuring. It was all legal, all proper, all following exactly the procedures outlined in the company's founding documents. I delivered copies to every board member personally, along with comprehensive evidence packets. Mark heard about the letter through the grapevine before he saw it himself. When he finally got his hands on a copy, I heard he laughed, thinking it was another empty gesture, another dramatic exit he could mock. He gathered a few of his remaining allies and read portions aloud, apparently amused by what he thought was my desperate attempt at relevance. He had no idea he was reading a takeover notice until legal and financial teams arrived to explain what he had just dismissed so casually. The moment when Mark finally understood what was happening became legendary in our office. He was in a meeting, still chuckling about my ridiculous resignation letter, when the company's senior legal counsel walked in with the CFO and 3 board members. "Mark, we need to talk about the shareholder petition and governance review that was triggered this morning," the legal counsel said seriously. Mark's smile faltered. "What petition?" They laid it all out for him. The shares I had acquired, the bylaws I had invoked, the evidence I had compiled, the votes I had secured. His face went through several colors as he realized that the letter he had been mocking was actually a legally binding document that had just activated a formal review of his leadership. The board members were stone-faced, clearly not amused by the situation. "This isn't legally possible," Mark stammered. "She can't just—" "Actually, she can," the CFO interrupted, sliding the relevant bylaws across the table. "These provisions have been in our founding documents since the company was created. They've never been used before, but they're entirely valid." Mark looked at me, really looked at me, for perhaps the first time in all the years we had worked together. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to horror as he realized how completely he had underestimated me. The room held its breath. I remained composed, my face neutral, watching the moment I had worked toward for so long finally arrive. The board moved quickly once the review process was officially triggered. Within a week, Mark was stripped of his executive decision-making powers pending a full investigation. The evidence I had compiled was overwhelming: years of taking credit for others' work, multiple instances of financial mismanagement, a pattern of client complaints that had been buried or ignored. Documentation of hostile work environment complaints that HR had filed but never escalated. It all came pouring out in formal testimonies from colleagues who had been waiting years for someone to finally hold him accountable. Mark tried to fight back, hearing lawyers and making threats, but every move he made only reinforced the case against him. Some colleagues whispered in corners. A few actually cheered quietly when the news spread. The transformation in office culture was immediate. People started speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas they had been afraid to voice before, taking ownership of their work without fear that someone would steal credit. I watched it all unfold from my position as a concerned shareholder and longtime employee, careful not to appear vindictive or celebratory. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about creating a workplace where competence mattered more than politics, where people were valued for their actual contributions rather than their ability to network up. When the board officially offered me a leadership position, it wasn't just a consolation prize or a temporary fix. It was recognition of everything I had built over 10 years of dedicated work. They restructured the executive team, creating accountability measures that should have existed all along, and placed me in a position where I could actually implement the changes I had been advocating for years. My first actions were focused on empowering the people who had been overlooked under the previous regime. I promoted based on merit rather than favoritism, gave credit where it was actually due, and created transparent processes for decision-making and project management. The company didn't transform overnight, but the cultural shift was immediate and obvious. People started collaborating instead of competing destructively. Ideas flowed more freely. Clients noticed the difference in how we communicated and operated. I led with integrity, professionalism, and genuine respect for every person on the team, from senior managers to entry-level analysts. It wasn't complicated or innovative. It was just basic good leadership that had been missing for far too long. The transformation was complete not because I had destroyed Mark, but because we had collectively built something better in the space his arrogance had occupied. 6 months after taking leadership, I was asked to address the entire company at our annual meeting. It was a moment I had imagined during all those long nights of planning, but the reality was different from my fantasies. I wasn't vindictive or triumphant in my speech. I didn't mention Mark by name or dwell on past failures. Instead, I talked about vision, ethics, and teamwork. I spoke about the importance of recognizing everyone's contributions, creating space for people to grow, and building a company culture based on respect rather than fear. I acknowledged the painful transition we had gone through and thanked people for their resilience during uncertainty. The response was powerful: standing ovation, tears from colleagues who had felt invisible for years, messages from clients who appreciated the changes they had witnessed. That same week, Mark quietly left the company with a settlement agreement. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no movie-style showdown. He simply exited, his arrogance finally broken by the reality of consequences he had spent years avoiding. I felt no particular satisfaction in his departure, just a quiet sense of justice served and a chapter finally closed. The company was moving forward, and that was what actually mattered. A year after everything changed, I sat in my office, formerly Mark's office, now completely redesigned to reflect actual functionality rather than ego, reflecting on the journey from public humiliation to respected leadership. The company was thriving under the new structure. We had retained clients that Mark's mismanagement had nearly lost, attracted new business through our improved reputation, and most importantly, created a workplace where talented people actually wanted to stay and contribute. Industry publications had started recognizing the transformation, writing articles about our remarkable turnaround and my unconventional rise to leadership. I gave interviews occasionally, always emphasizing strategy over drama, patience over revenge. The story resonated because it wasn't about social media callouts or public destruction. It was about intelligence, preparation, and playing the long game with integrity. People called me for advice, asked how I had managed such a complex corporate maneuver, wanted to know the secret to turning betrayal into empowerment. The answer was always the same: know your worth, document everything, build genuine relationships, and use the system's own rules to create change. My resignation letter had indeed been a takeover notice, but the real takeover wasn't of a position or a title. It was reclaiming my own power and showing that competence and strategy will always outlast arrogance and bluster.